human beings by virtue of their being human beings, nothing else, regardless of what culture they are from, regardless of their nationality, regardless even of their color or their gender. Simply the fact that they are human puts certain principles in place, the violations of which must be discouraged, must be even punished. And that would be the case with things like punishing people when they engage in objectionable speech. This is not a relativistic notion. Objectionable speech at a very fundamental level may very well be identifiable. If I insult your religion, insult your family, insult your ethnic history and so on, I may objectively do something wrong. But if you retaliate for my insulting you, or insulting your background, or insulting your religion and so on, if you retaliate by attacking me physically, that too is objectively identifiable as something wrong. And the reason for that is something that I want to turn to now. I have now talked a good deal about instances of state violation of individual rights, but why these individual rights? What's the what makes them sacrosanct? Why should the individual rights be violated? What's the big deal? I mean, a lot of people, for example, with certain political views, do not believe that the right to private property should be a universal principle. In fact, they believe that a right to private property is some sort of bourgeois ideological device where the ruling class is being defended against legitimate protests from other members of society. So what about these basic rights? What about the right to free expression? Why is that a right that we ought to honor? So we have to address, at least briefly and succinctly, the question of, do human beings have rights? And what are the rights that they all have? What are these supposedly universal human rights? And there are obviously there's a widespread agreement that there are some universal human rights that are worth announcing and defending and incorporating in constitutions. The United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights sort of attests to that, where presumably over 100 countries can sign up to a document. So there is some intimation or suggestion of universality and non-cultural relativism here. But is there any good argument for those things? Well, we have to look back to the origin of this whole notion of individual rights. It began many, many years ago in Western political thought, and there were some intimations of it even in Eastern political thought. Perhaps the most emphatic and hard, extensive attempt to defend the notion of individual rights came from the philosopher John Locke, who claimed that human beings have a certain stable nature. Maybe not stable for eternity, but stable long enough so that for practical purposes, one ought to pay attention to this nature in conceiving of a just, good human community. That is, if you want to know what is a just, what is a fitting community for human beings, the most important thing that you ought to pay attention to is what is human nature. Without knowing what human nature is, it's going to be very difficult to tell what is fitting for human survival and flourishing in a community. And that's the whole idea. This is all an attempt to somehow secure a basis for a widespread concern, a concern that is ages old, and that is whether a society is just or unjust, whether its institutions are fundamentally on the side of justice versus injustice. Again, there are all kinds of relativistic arguments against the very notion of using justice in this universalistic sense, but as I already suggested to you, those arguments themselves fall prey to their own implications. If you really are against any form of universal standards, then the criticism of universal standards also must fall. So I'll leave that aside for the time being. I want to go look at what are these rights that supposedly are being violated by, say, the German Constitution and many other constitutions, and by a bunch of individual human beings who act in a way that violates provisions of individual rights in various constitutions. Where do these rights come from? What do they mean? Well, some of you will know my answer to this because you have been to some of my lectures over the week. But essentially the answer is this, that a human being someone who needs to make choices between right and wrong conduct, needs a sphere of personal authority so that he or she can be the agent of that conduct. That you are not a puppet, you're not being forced into acting the way you do, but you choose your actions, and then you can be evaluated whether those actions are right or wrong. If you don't have your freedom, your sovereignty to choose the actions you engage in, then those actions are not really yours, and you can't be criticized for them. You can't be said to be immoral or unethical or wrong-headed or corrupt or prejudicial or anything if what you do is really the function of your having been made to do it, if you are coerced to do it. We know that even in the criminal law, if someone can demonstrate that criminal conduct was coerced upon him or her, that is an exonerating factor. That means that they are not guilty of what they are accused of because they did not choose to engage in the conduct. So responsible behavior, be that in the law or be that in morality, requires liberty. Without that liberty, personal responsibility cannot be assigned. This is fairly evident from anybody who thinks about how children grow up through stages where they assume greater and greater responsibility for their conduct as they mature, as they take over the governance of their lives from their parents and assume responsibility for how they live and what they do themselves. But that all requires that their freedom be respected. And rights are a standard of freedom. If I have a right to my life, that means that I get to choose what this life is to be devoted for, what it's spent on, what goals I will pursue with this life, and you don't get to do it, and the state doesn't get to do it, and the Roman Catholic Church doesn't get to do it, unless I agree. My consent is required for me to have a responsibility for what I do. Even if it's a long-term consent, like joining a political party or a fraternity or whatever, it requires consent for me to then be responsible for the conduct that is involved in joining this organization. That requires me to do certain things. If I were conscripted to the organization, which is one of the problems of the responsibility of soldiers who have been conscripted into the military rather than joined up voluntarily, is just how much responsibility they are supposed to shoulder in what they do in times of war, on the battlefield, and so on. So one of the preconditions of having a responsible life, of leading a responsible life, is that you have a sphere of personal authority, that you are the one who's in charge of your conduct, not other people. And this is where the concept of rights arises.